Hello again, everyone. Welcome back. This next session will look at the role of regulators and how they can and should play their part in helping society and the wider economy adapt and respond to what clearly are very challenging times. Whether it's the COVID pandemic, economic or political uncertainties, Brexit, climate change, the rapid growth of online shopping, any number of key issues, it's arguable the role of regulators is more important than ever. But how can a regulatory environment be established that meets the needs of tomorrow as well as today, especially if the future is hard to predict when it comes to what form of services or businesses might take or what challenges may be around the corner? Many regulators, including the SRA, have strived for flexibility, moving away from detailed prescriptive regulation based on explicit rules, preferring instead to publish ethical principles, codes of conduct, and rules on behaviors which must underpin how professionals and businesses operate day to day. But is this the right approach? And can we get smarter at predicting the unpredictable? Let's discuss this with our expert panel. Dr. Pauline Stephen is Chief Executive and Registrar of the General Teaching Council for Scotland. Matthew Gill is a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Government. And Elena Kozakova is Chief Economist and Senior Director of Analytics at Ofwat, the water regulator. Full biographies of all our panelists are available on the link below this video stream. And if you want to ask a question, and I really hope you do, just click on the Q&A link below this video, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. And there's also Twitter as well. Don't forget that. Hashtag #RegFutures, all one word. Panel, hello to you. Good to see you.
Hi.
Hi there.
Hello.
Okay, so let's begin. And I want to ask each of you in turn, given we live in such uncertain times, how can regulators be fleet of foot and flexible? Pauline.
Thanks, Clive. Good morning, everyone. I think the fundamental issue for me is about trust. I think to be trusted, we need to be somewhat predictable. Trust is so important to the professions, certainly that I register and regulate, and that extends to us as a regulatory body. So it's about trust while set in a context of, for me, what I would call being contextually literate, knowing the systems and the systems that you're working for and in. In Scotland, in education, that means embracing variation. Lots of rural schools, urban schools, mixed deprivation, different types of schools. So it's about embracing that variation, understanding it. I think the second thing for me, Clive, is about what I would call holding the tension, embracing the grey. Things are not black and white. There's lots of mixed in the middle that needs to be held on to and understood. And sometimes I think we get into politics of distraction there. We start focusing on the grey bits that are not so important, and we need to make sure we focus on the right things. And the last thing for me is really about values and ethics. So if all of this is held in and underpinned by the profession's understanding the core values and ethics, in my instance, what it means to become, to be, and to grow as a teacher, I think that is the foundation for being able to be more flexible.
Okay, that's a good start. Matthew, embracing the grey, is that what it's all about?
Absolutely agree with everything Pauline said. I guess my perspective on the issues is slightly different because my experience of regulation is from the financial sector prior to starting this role. So when I was thinking about this question, I would think, well, one way of responding and being fleet of foot is to try and understand what might happen, what risks might crystallise before they occur. So things like horizon scanning as a regulator, listening to the industry about the latest developments that might be happening in the area being regulated, contingency planning, stress testing, all of those things can help. But there will always be areas that you can't spot what's coming around the corner. And in those cases, it's important that the regulators are able to respond quickly to change when it occurs. That might mean considering whether the regulatory objectives are right, inserting yourself into the issues of the day. For instance, the the medical regulator got very involved in the specifications for the ventilators and the ventilator challenge during COVID. It wasn't necessarily their role, but they had the expertise and found a way of putting themselves into that. But I think also in responding to change, it's important to recognise and hold to what is constant. Regulation is there for a reason, and when things change, people will often articulate that things are different and things need to be thrown up in the air. But it's important to remain confident that regulation serves an important purpose, and even that may require saying no to a desire for change or relaxation at some points.
Okay, Elena, being able to say no to a possible innovation, is that the key then?
Well, I couldn't possibly comment on saying no to innovation, but I would say one thing that I have learned is that you just have to accept change will happen. If you think that you are planning your perfect regulatory solution and it will stick exactly as you intended it, it never happens. I have never seen it happen. So you have to embrace change. And you also need to be modest, realize that actually you don't know everything. And most of us play a very particular role within a wider system. So you need to understand where you fit within that system and what value you can add. And one other thing I've learned is that we tend to become really good and specialist, but we are not very good at learning from diverse sources. So I would say try to pierce your own bubble, talk to a variety of people you wouldn't normally talk to, and that will prepare you for embracing the change.
Okay. Pauline, I mean, COVID obviously has been a huge test for the educational sector. And it was interesting there, Elena talking about embracing change and Matthew pointing to the regulator's role in dealing with ventilators. How involved was the regulator in Scotland in dealing with how to tackle the problems that young people were going to have in catching up with their educations?
The short answer, Clive, is very involved, and I think it speaks to Elena's point about embracing change. So in Scotland, that tends to happen in an education world through consensus building. So you work together to reach solutions about how things are going to be managed. So as a result of COVID, we had to do things around about student teacher placements, what we were going to do to ensure that they were going to be able to be supported to achieve their qualification and then start their careers as teachers. I think one of the issues about consensus making and change is that speaks to Matthew's point about innovation. Sometimes the consensus approach limits the scope for innovation and being very different. And certainly in Scotland, from an educational focus during lockdowns, lots of discussion around about let's not go back to normal. Let's make education something different, something new, something where we've really bottomed out. What is the purpose of school? Why do children go to school and what's it for? And that was quite exciting for some people. But it's also quite fearful. Not everybody can embrace change in that way. And I'm not sure we'll always be able to take everybody with us in that approach. So I think it's about understanding the teaching, as in my world, teaching as the profession. What's it about? What's it for? It's incredibly complex. Really great teachers make it look really easy. So let's professionalise and talk about the profession of teaching. And I would also say, Clive, everybody has, sometimes there are very bold ideas about what should happen, bold ideas about what will change in education, but we need to be bold and specific. We need to get into the actual, what is this going to look like in reality? How will this impact on teachers, on children, on families? And there's excitement there, but I think there's also fear there for some people.
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting, Matthew, because we're talking about regulators being involved in certain sectors in a much deeper way than perhaps regulators in other areas. So when it comes to formulating policy on exams for the education sector, or ventilators for the health sector, does that upset government? Or are they pleased about the involvement of regulators in being part of the process and ultimately spreading the blame if something goes wrong?
Sorry, was that a question to me?
Yeah.
I think it depends a little bit on the particular question. I mean, I think in that particular example I was giving, my understanding is that government were very pleased about that because you needed the expertise to come from where it comes from. And I think if you're in a crisis situation, often it's a crisis because it cuts across institutional boundaries and it's a situation that you hadn't foreseen. So something like the COVID response is going to require a response from the health sector, but we were also thinking about social distancing. There wasn't a department for social distancing. And so it requires a lot of multi-agency working to work out how things are going to operate. And then regulators will often have a lot of the depth expertise in some areas that needs to be brought to bear in that. But the challenge is then, if you like, choreographing and convening a cross-institutional discussion that's going to be effective quickly in those situations. So listening to regulators, listening to other bodies that might have something to say, and then trying to make a decision which takes all of those perspectives into account.
But if you, for instance, go back to the credit crunch and the period leading off from that, and you have a government potentially wherever it is in the world that is getting pressure from ordinary citizens, pressure from the public, society, newspapers or whatever to clamp down. But then you have the regulator and the business itself saying, well, look, you've still got to have economic growth. You've still got to have a certain amount of openness and freedom in order for the sector to eventually flourish. There can be tensions there, can't there?
Absolutely. And you end up trying to do both things. I mean, one of the things we learned from the financial crisis and from the COVID crisis is that government is essential. We can't assume that economic life or social life can just go on without government involvement. And so you realise how important these structures are. But at the same time, when you're seeking to recover from those kind of events, economic growth is hugely important, innovation is hugely important. And so you see regulators trying to introduce competition objectives, trying to set up sandboxes to experiment with new ways of doing things within a controlled environment to try and see if we can come out of these situations as quickly as possible. So I think in a way there can be a tension if you see it as an either or problem, but I think you need both government involvement and innovation and the encouragement of diversity alongside each other.
Yeah, it clearly has to be a partnership, doesn't it? I wonder, Elena, I mean, is there always a risk that we take our eye off the long term as we deal with the short term? I mean, how can we truly regulate for both? For example, for Ofwat, for instance, keeping all our taps running when we have to deal with climate change?
I mean, that's a very good question. And there will be a tension. For a regulator like Ofwat, the role we play within the wider regulatory framework is to ensure that customers don't overpay, but there is enough investment, right? And there is an inherent tension. If you are a specific sector regulator, you are often not the one making these long-term decisions for the country. How much infrastructure should we have? How bad is the climate change? How much do we need to mitigate it? You cannot just have one regulator, certainly not an economic regulator, deciding that. You will have a conference of regulators. And you should definitely not leave it to a standoff between private companies and a regulator, because then you are at an impasse. A regulator like us has to decide how high the bills should be. Companies want the bills to be high, but they may want them to be high for their own reasons, or they may want them to be high because there is need for investment. And it's often quite impossible for a regulator to decide which of those arguments prevails. So you need to broaden the discussion and have a bit more evidence. Ask the experts. So you can't leave it just to one regulator. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. But does it perhaps sort of, make you a little bit frustrated, to use that word? I could use a stronger one, when, you've got the public and the press saying, the prices are too high. And, my pipe has burst and there's a hole in the feed for water or whatever. But all those issues, and you're the regulator, but you're not actually the person dealing with the product itself?
I don't think that is the area of frustration. We, as a regulator, we need to drive up quality, but the quality itself is being driven up by the companies who deliver the service. UK has gone for a very particular way of regulating, which is we have private companies running main utilities, and you have independent regulators checking up on them through price controls, revenue controls, all sorts of other mechanisms. So it is a system where we have a particular role. We have a role to set the framework so that companies can deliver high quality outcomes, but it is ultimately for the companies to deliver those outcomes. And if they don't, then we use our enforcement powers and other powers. So it is a system. This would not be the source of frustration for me. What often is the lack of information, the real understanding, understanding really how climate change impacts on the water network, what needs to be invested in, when. These are questions that are difficult. They're difficult for the companies themselves. Let's not make it as a sort of regulator frustrated with companies. This is a difficult, wicked issue for the system that we need to understand.
Yeah. I mean, Pauline, I just wondered then how difficult it was for you as a regulator to balance the needs of keeping the schools open, potentially, as more and more children fell behind, while not compromising public protection.
Thanks, Clive. I would love to take responsibility for the decisions about closure of schools in Scotland, but it didn't sit with us as a regulatory body. It sat with the Scottish Government, and we were part of that partnership process. But as a regulator, during the pandemic, I think it was starting with an analysis of, very basically, what can we control, what can we influence, and what do we just have to accept is happening, and we have to deal with it. So from our point of view, we had to accept schools were closing. We had to accept that meant that, for instance, student teachers were going to be unable to conclude their education programme to become teachers. So there's a bit about control, influence, accept, and then within that, what are our red lines as a professional body, to ensure public protection? Where are our root non-negotiables that we can compromise within? And there's a certain level that, no, that's what we need in order to maintain quality and protect children and the public. So it's not a straightforward process, I don't think, Clive, but it is an analytical one, and a clear understanding as a regulator about where are the red lines, where can the flexibility go and where does it have to stop?
But you were part of the decision-making process, or the thinking behind whether or not schools should shut down. Obviously, it's up to Holyrood and Nicola Sturgeon or whatever to decide. But you were part of that process. What was your input in that process then?
Sorry, Clive. The input, the approach that Scotland took to managing education during the crisis was to do so in partnership. So there was a range of partnership groups established. Yeah. Our role, like many other national bodies, was to make connections to the impact of the decisions. So I had a connection to make to people becoming teachers, brand new teachers who have to do so much service, Clive, to be able to qualify fully as teachers. So everybody's role in that space was to make the connections as to the impact of the decisions, and then work together really to form solutions. And I think one of the strengths for us as a regulatory body that has come out of it are much stronger partnership arrangements with some of our partners, just because of the speed and the scale and the force with which it was, we need to make decisions and we need to do them together. And actually, I'm really optimistic that some of those experiences have set partnership working up in a different place, which is really positive.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I just want to remind everyone tuning in that you can send in your questions for our experts. Just use the question link below the video. We really do want to hear your thoughts on all this. Matthew, the last big economic shock was obviously the credit crunch. I mean, what do you think was learnt from that experience? And are these lessons still applicable today when it comes to regulation?
I mean, very much so. I think a lot was learnt, and I think the thing to remember about the credit crisis is that it followed quite a long period of relative economic stability in the UK. So obviously since then we've had EU exit, we've had COVID, and so people are maybe more used now to major turmoil than they were in 2008. And so I think that the lesson from that is even when things look stable, don't be complacent, don't assume that they're going to continue to be. I think the obvious one from the finance side is don't trust a single model or a single theory about how a market works or how people are going to respond. It's really important to look at things in a diversity of ways to understand the risks and behaviours that you might see. I remember I was teaching a course on economic sociology in an American university in 2007, and not many people subscribed to that because it was seen as quite a fringe interest. I think if I'd been teaching that in 2009, 2010, there might have been much more interest, and I think that's something to bear in mind. And I think the point that I was making right at the start actually as well, that the role of government, even in what appear to be very private markets, is essential, even if it's not always visible. And so being aware of that is important.
Sure. I mean, Elena, you talked earlier about embracing change, but is there a risk that the more flexible regulators make their rules, the more uncertainty this causes for those they regulate and consumers?
So I would agree with one of the first things that Pauline said, that we need to be predictable. This is where regulators really make a difference. And if we are not predictable, it will manifest itself in how much consumers will end up paying, because that will then reflect itself in how expensive it is for companies to raise debt based on the word we give them. So predictability is really important. But where I would sort of slightly challenge the suggestion that flexibility automatically means lack of predictability is that you can't write a perfect regulatory contract. And the more you try, the more you are like Don Quixote. It doesn't work. So we have learned over the 30 years that we've had experience with economic regulation that having sound principles and being precise where we need to be, but allowing companies flexibility is really important, because we have tried, and where we need to and where it is obvious what it is that we need to stipulate, we will be very precise, but it's not beneficial either for consumers or actually for innovation and the freedom that companies then can have to produce something new and something good if you over specify. And we are a step removed. We will have what we call in economics asymmetry of information. Companies will have more information than we have in general. So we need to be humble and understand that if we over specify and it goes wrong, then that's not a good outcome either. So be predictable, but flexibility and predictability don't have to clash.
Okay, so Pauline, for instance, you're ready for the possibility of another huge spike in COVID cases, and as a result, schools having to shut down wholesale again.
Absolutely, and I would agree with what Elena has described there, because for us as a regulator of the teaching profession in Scotland, it's where you actually need to have predictable protocols and regulation in specific parts of your business. And for me, it's about what is regulation. So regulation is, as Elena described, it's a whole system approach that requires trust within the system. And from my point of view, requires professional standards, professional codes of practice, a focus on ethics and values. That's part of regulation. This is what it means to be a teacher in Scotland. This is what you are signing up to. However, if there is a concern with your fitness to teach, that's where we need to have very precise systems that people understand, can engage with and take part in. And then we build learning into that process. What are we learning from those experiences of the harder end of regulation, and do we need to change anything to do with our standards and our codes? So it's all interconnected, and and that exists kind of regardless of whether schools are open or shut.
Right, of course. These are underlying principles that will guide for the majority, one hopes, of situations. I wonder then, Matthew, is the long-term fallout from Brexit, for instance, still an issue that requires more regulatory intervention, perhaps?
I think that's not entirely clear. I mean, I think the hope from exiting from the EU, or one of the hopes, was that less regulation would be required in certain areas, or that we would have more control over the nature of that regulation. I think, obviously, as with any kind of creation of an institutional boundary, there's going to be regulation required at the border with the EU in various forms, be that in people, in goods. And over time, the regulation that we have imported from the EU into UK statute is going to need to be kept up to date and to be iterated, and so more regulatory decisions or more regulatory policy decisions are going to need to be made in the UK, if you like. But that was the intention, and
question here for you, Elena. What has Ofwat learnt, including from other sectors, re-regulating for uncertainty while keeping bills stable for consumers? How do you balance the two?
Right, these are really difficult questions. I will not have the perfect answer, but one thing that we have learned, especially after credit crunch, was perhaps because, as Matthew said, we hadn't had a big economic disruption for a long time. We all got a bit nervous about it and we overcorrected. We gave the industry a little bit too much protection, and that, with the wonderful benefit of hindsight, proved to be perhaps too expensive for consumers. So the important thing is you will not get it right always, but it is to learn, it's to understand what happened, why did we overcorrect, and how not to overcorrect in the future. Also, if we had undercorrected, that would have had a very negative impact as well. But we tend to overcorrect as regulators. We tend to err on the side of caution, which then filters down through to customer bills. We do worry about investment and attracting investment into the UK, into different utilities, and it costs money. So that is something where taking a step back and looking, which way are you more likely to err is quite important, and looking across sectors is also important. We work very closely with the energy regulator because they have a similar network, similar issues, and learning just from what they have done is very helpful, including the tools that we are using, that they are using. We are learning from each other, but also seeing, are we all slightly overcorrecting or not? So that is really important.
Sure. I mean, you have fining powers, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, and a second question that's come in here. I mean, is having fining powers actually helpful, or can the threat of big fines drive the wrong behaviours, i.e. tick box compliance?
If I may pick that question up again, it depends on how you apply those rules, like with everything. So you have to make sure that the rules, that the fines are attached to something that really matters to consumers. If you look at some of our biggest fines in the recent history, north of £100 million, these were levied on companies that have failed to deliver on some key environmental metrics. So leakage, water absolutely uselessly leaked into the environment. So you go through all the trouble of extracting water, of cleaning it using a lot of energy, and then it leaks and it's not used. So that was one of our biggest fines. And another one was pollution incidents by a company which simply disregarded all environmental regulations. And the other regulators who do not have such fining power in terms of how much money they can levy from companies rely on us to do our job and compel companies. And very big fines do have an impact, a deterrent impact. If you see what a company is up to and then how it is fined, if you're another company looking at it, you will think twice before you breach your obligations. So I'm very much in favor of fines if they are applied to the right things.
Sure. I mean, Pauline, what is your sanction power?
That's Kyle. I'm just waving to let my light back on before I answer you. Sorry about that. It doesn't want to do it, but it will come in a minute. We don't have a fining power as the General Teaching Council for Scotland, so we have a process called Fitness to Teach. Right. So our sanctions are the ability to put restrictions on an individual's ability to be a teacher and to be a teacher at all. So we have the power to work with an individual to say that their conduct is not becoming of someone to be a teacher and therefore restrict their ability to teach in Scotland. So it's that end of regulation for us, Clive, that needs to be predictable, understood with protocols and rules, because you're dealing with very serious matters under public protection and individuals, really.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder then, Matthew, as a general principle, I mean, is there the risk that, you know, powerful sanctions can drive the wrong behaviours?
Oh, definitely. And I think this plays actually to an underlying debate, I think, in regulation about whether you regulate according to very prescriptive rules or according to more general principles. And so a fine, obviously, is a sanction that's driven out of a rules-based regime, which says the rule has to be very precise, and you step over this line, you get fined and punished. And that's sometimes necessary, particularly if you've got a regulator that is regulating a very large population of regulated entities where you need a really clear and simple rule. But when you get into things like professional regulation or something like that, you're dealing with sophisticated actors who understand their profession and actually need principles, guidance on how they should be making decisions themselves in the situations they find themselves in, because those situations are often far too complicated for a rule to have predicted in advance of a professional being in the situation they find themselves. And so those principles are important. The thing that's then difficult, but also important, is to give those principles teeth. So if you're saying we're not holding somebody to account to a rule, we're holding them to account to a principle, you need to be able to then have a discussion with them about whether that principle has been observed, and ultimately to have sanctions deriving from the outcome of that discussion. And that's really difficult if it's not rules-based.
See, that's really interesting. Elena, do the water companies want regulation? Because that helps promote trust in who they are, although it might not necessarily be, on occasion, commercially what is the best thing.
Well, I'm not sure any company wants to be regulated, right? That constrains their freedom. But in the case of water companies, they are regional monopolies. And actually, in most of the value chain, they are natural monopolies, which means that there is no other more socially effective way of delivering the service than to have a monopoly. And when you have a monopoly, you have an acute risk of underinvestment and overpricing. So they need to be regulated. And they were only allowed to operate as private companies with the view that there was going to be a regulator. And unless you introduce competition, which in this case you can't, you have to have a regulator. So that's an accepted situation in the industry. They know that they need to be regulated. There would always be, whatever regime you choose, there would always be some degree of regulation. But I guess there are areas where predictability is really important, and therefore high quality regulation will be valued by companies. For example, that will influence their cost of capital if they are predictable. How easy it is for them to issue debt. That will depend on how fair and predictable and clear the regulatory contract is. But within that, they would probably want to have a lot of freedom. And the way we try to square it and where we landed after 30 years of experience with regulating would be to say, we want to have a principles-based regulation, that you do not drill down on things you do not need to drill down when there is a huge asymmetry of information, or where there are many possible outcomes that would be beneficial for consumers, but you set principles of good behavior. So that would be one way of doing it. But then there are other areas where you need to be a bit more prescriptive. And one way we used to regulate in an area like water is to compare. So we don't know what the absolute level of leakage should be. I note that Tokyo only leaks 2% of water, right? This is quite far from the almost 20 that is common in the UK. But we don't know how economical it would be for the whole of the UK to do what Tokyo has achieved. But we look at what each company has achieved and we benchmark them. Right. So that way we achieve a degree of compulsion. We will see what the best players in the industry are, and we tell the others, well, you need to do as well as the others. So that is one way of giving companies an ability to influence their performance, choose their actions, but also for us to compel good performance.
Yeah. I mean, Pauline, we talked earlier about the sort of consensual approach taken in Scotland about how to deal with the COVID crisis and education. We've got a question here that's just come in. How much is there a risk that regulators get too involved in how professionals do their day-to-day job? We had Matthew talk about, governments appreciate the expertise. But is there the possibility that regulators can get too involved with other sectors?
I think, Clive, the answer there for me is around about regulators adding value.
Yeah.
So as well as being a regulator, surely our work is about enhancing professionalism. That's where our advice makes a difference, I would argue. So I think it's about regulators ensuring that they don't have either real or what can be perceived as bureaucratic hoops, that actually they add value and that they're proportionate in the response. So we're certainly not about the punishing or involvement of something that's happened. We're about looking to the future and protecting learners and public in the future. So I think it's about adding value and really being mindful of the system and understanding it well.
Sure. That sounds like a pretty good note to end our session on. Regulators should be adding value and being proportionate in their response. That sums it up, really. Thank you all so much for that. And to everyone who submitted questions, thanks again to our panel. And we really want to hear from you out there, what you thought about the session. The evaluation link is just below this broadcast. Click on it and let us know what you thought. We'll also be sending out an email to get your feedback. We've got 2 more sessions today at 11:45. We'll be joined by experts from the Office of Students and Black Solicitors Network to discuss the role regulators can play in shifting the dial on diversity and inclusion. Then at 12:40, we'll discuss the regulatory risks and opportunities linked to technology and innovation with a panel including members from the Financial Inclusion Centre, Information Commissioner's Office and Competitions and Markets Authority. Matthew Gill, Pauline Stephen, Lena Kozakova, thank you so much for joining us for a fascinating session. And I'll see you all again in a few minutes' time. Many thanks.